Welcome to MEGAFOON Rugby, the home of your favorite rugby podcasts. If you're into rugby, this is certainly the place to be. And to those who've subscribed already and help us grow this channel into what it's already become, thank you. And to those who haven't, please make sure you press the subscribe button, like and share this video, and become part of this MEGAFOON family. On the subject of something special, it's my pleasure to welcome back one of our favorite rugby podcasters, John Robbie. Welcome, John.
Yeah, great to be chatting to you again, MV, and what a wonderful reaction we've had. People love the chats we have about rugby and also some of the old stories, but my goodness, it makes me feel old sometimes.
I know. The bad thing for me is when you talk about something that happened way back when, and I actually remember being alive and I watched it or I heard about it. Yeah.
You know what they say, MV, the older I get, the better I was.
Yeah. That's absolutely true. I hear you. Okay. So what we're going to do now, this weekend, of course, is the big game, Ireland versus Australia. It's Andy Farrell versus Joe Schmidt, the disciple versus the mentor. But there's more to it than that. Andy Farrell used to play league for England. He's played in 2 World Cups. I don't know if many people know that. League for England, and he switched over to Union. So we thought we'd go back a little bit in history, dig into the history of Union versus League, why there's such rivalry, where that came from. And the first person that you mentioned to me when we started discussing this was a guy called Ken Goodall. Now, I didn't know who he was, but I went and read up about him, and it's such a poignant story. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Ken Goodall was one of my absolute rugby heroes. He was born in England, but from Irish parents, and he came from Derry in the north of Ireland, a very troubled city, came from a very unionist Protestant background. And he was a magnificent rugby player. He was for his time, he was big. He was about 6'3.5", and he was about 14.5 stone. But my goodness, what an athlete. He was absolutely brilliant, and he got picked to play for Ireland at the age of 19. He was the youngest player to play for Ireland since the great Carl Mullen, the hooker who captained Ireland to Triple Crown and Championship fame right back in the 40s. And Ken Goodall was this rangy guy. He dominated the lineouts. And somebody said when you tackled him, it was like tackling a bag of spanners, which I've never heard as a better description about tackling a really hard rugby player. And I think back in my time about tackling Ray Mort, or trying to tackle Ray Mort or Donny Gerber, and tackling a bag of spanners comes to mind. So Ken Goodall was absolutely brilliant. As I say, he got capped at 19. He never missed a game. He was always man of the match. That's another thing we can talk about, because I'm not a great fan of man of the matches. But he was this brilliant rugby player. And he played for Ireland. He was a star. He then went to Australia on the tour in 1967 and played in the first ever Southern Hemisphere loss to a Northern Hemisphere team, which was Ireland when they beat Australia in 1967. I think the score was 10-5 or 11-5 or something like that. He was an absolute star. He came back 1968. He was the best number 8, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, possibly in the world. And but he couldn't go on the Lions tour to South Africa because he was at Newcastle University studying engineering. He was a bright guy as well. And he got a special dispensation to go with the Irish tour the year before to postpone his exams, but they wouldn't give it the second time. So he couldn't go on the Lions tour. They weren't prepared to wait for him, as they did with other players, like Gerald Davis famously in 1971 was allowed to complete his exams and then come later on that famous tour. But then Barry John, the great Barry John, got injured. And such was the need to get Goodall over on the 68 tour, because it was a very tough tour against a very good Springbok side. But to replace fly half Barry John, they brought out number 8 Ken Goodall. So he arrived in a blitz of publicity, and his first game, talk about being unlucky, was against Eastern Transvaal at the Pambrink Stadium. Now, you talk to anyone who's toured South Africa, and there is something terrifying about the name Eastern Transvaal and Pambrink Stadium. As a Lions colleague of mine, the late Peter Morgan, said after a dirty game there, when the dressing room was like a battle station at Passchendaele in the First World War, and there was silence. The Lions had scraped a win, And he looked up and he said, I don't know who this Pam Brink was, but she must have been one hell of a tough lady. Of course, not realizing that Pam Brink was a man and a local politician, etc. So poor old Ken Goodall arrived with this complicated story, the whole world waiting for this genius to galvanize the Lions team. And can you believe he broke his hand in the first 5 minutes of the game? He played on for the whole game with a broken hand, but it was so badly broken that he had to go home. So his Lions tour lasted one game. But still, he starred for Ireland 3 years in a row. They played against Wales. They beat Wales. And at the height of his fame, the absolute height of his fame, was 1970. And Wales were going for a triple crown. Ireland had a very, very good side. But Wales at that time, it was the beginning of the golden era with Gareth Edwards, Barry John, Mervyn Davis, Gerald Davis, John Dawes. I mean, the names roll off the tongue. And Wales came to Dublin in 1970. I was there as a schoolboy, and I'll never, ever forget it, because the feeling was, you know, almost not can Ireland beat Wales, but can Ireland stay with this Welsh team? They were so brilliant. Based around the London Welsh side at the time, who were the best club side probably in the world. And amazingly, Ireland won 14-0, which in those days was like 50 points to nil. Now, they destroyed Wales. And late in the game, Ken Goodall, this rangy number 8, picked up the ball around the halfway line. He chipped it over Barry John's head. He gathered the ball from the chip and he outpaced JPR Williams to score under the posts. So it was a 15-meter try of incredible brilliance. The only try I can think to compare with it was that try that Bob Skinstad scored against Ireland, when Bob, before his injury, was in his absolute pomp, and he scored a try against Ireland from number 8, which was similar. But Ken Goodall wasn't just a star. He was good looking. He was this brilliant rugby player. He seemed to be incredibly modest. And here he was leading the team, you know, with his example. He wasn't the captain that beat Wales. So he was only about, 24 years of age. And you thought, what is this man going to achieve? And in fact, the great Mervyn Davis, probably the greatest number 8 to play in the Northern Hemisphere, certainly, legendary player on 2 Lions tours. And he said late in life, he said, if Ken Goodall had played on in rugby union, nobody would have heard of me. And I think that statement summarizes just how good Ken Goodall was at the time. He got married young. He was an engineer, but can you believe in Ireland in the depression of those years? We talk about the Celtic Tiger, Ireland now, but in those days, Ireland was seen as a somewhat backwater for the economy. And he got married. He was living with his mother. And his mother, by the way, he told a lovely story, being an arch unionist, in other words, Protestant British citizen in Ireland. When Ken used to play for Ireland, because it's as we've talked about before, there's one team covers Ireland north and south. She used to drape a blanket over the television when they played the national anthem of Ireland, because she was so unionist rather than Republican. And that was a very, very funny story. And of course, that was the reason why the players from Ulster never sang, because in their own communities, they would have been heavily criticized if they sang the national anthem. But I digress. So here he was, this brilliant rugby player in this amateur game, just got married, living at home, no prospect of buying a house or whatever, couldn't get a job as an engineer. So he was actually teaching, and he went on to have a great teaching career. And then out of the blue, they announced that Ken Goodall was going to play rugby league. And he wasn't going to Wigan or to Leeds or to Warrington or one of the great sides. He was going to Workington Town, who played in the 2nd division. And they've never revealed what the signing on fee he got was, but it must have been absolutely massive. He was also teaching at the time, so he doubled, trebled, quadrupled his salary, and also got this massive signing on fee. And of course, in those days, that was a line you could not cross. If you even talk to rugby league people, if you talk to scouts from rugby league or visited a rugby league club, you could be banned from playing rugby union. And we'll talk about the history of this great schism that happened between the two sports. So poor old Ken Goodall went over. He took the king's shillings, so to speak, and he was an absolute superstar. I think he scored something like 13 tries in his first 11 games. But because he was so dominant, he was targeted. And of course, there was no lineouts in rugby league. We'll talk about that as well. So that wasn't a particular advantage. So he played for about 3 or 4 years. He damaged his knee. He ended up having his back fused. And then at an incredibly young age, he had to retire. And he came back and he taught in Northern Ireland, but he was totally banned. At one stage, he wasn't even allowed to go in to watch his old club, the City of Derry, a very, very famous old club in Northern Ireland. He had to stand outside and watch the games through the fence. And I can remember, and it was a tragedy. He has never, because he passed away very young, he never ever said he regretted it. He said, look, there were the circumstances. I regretted playing the excitement of international games at Lansdowne Road or Twickenham or Murrayfield or Cardiff, whatever, but I had to make a decision and I had to live with it. But for us rugby fans, rugby people in Ireland, it was an absolute tragedy. And I remember once I was playing for Ireland. We stayed in the old Shelburne Hotel. And I think I was waiting for Jenny to come for the dance, my wife Jenny to come for the dance afterwards. And I popped into the bar just to see what was going on, to pass some time. And standing in the corner was this giant of a man wearing this old great coat. And he was there and he was knocking back whiskies. And it was Ken Goodall. And I so regret that I never went up to him and said, Mr. Goodall, I was an absolute fan of yours, and talked to him and even got to know him to this day. And then at the age of 50 something, he got sick and passed away. But for rugby fans in Ireland in particular, Ken Goodall is a tragic, tragic story. And in a way, it brings me back to think of this great divide between rugby union and rugby league, which nowadays is still there. But of course, players can go from one to the other with no problems. But in those days, it was so different. You mentioned Ken Goodall to any Irish rugby fan of a certain age, and they will go shame. They'll just say shame.
I think, just to put it in perspective, in 1970, some rugby magazine, I can't remember the name right now, awarded him the title of the International Player of the Year. And he was that good. And then he goes to league. You know, the shock must have been incredible.
It was terrible. And of course, in those days, I mean, there's a bit of controversy about giving players awards at the moment. And let me nail my colours to the mast immediately, Envia. I hate, apart from the modern lingo with rugby and apart from this practice of everybody congratulating each other when they win a turnover or a scrum England, or something like that, even if they're lucky with the decision and you think the penalty could have gone the other way. That's one of the things I hate about rugby at the moment. But also this man of the match, this coach of the year, which everything. I mean, if you're having a coach of the year, how can you not pick Rassie Erasmus? I mean, it is so ludicrous. It's ridiculous. But as a very, very good friend of mine from my old club, Greystones, Mick Dunn, who hasn't been too well recently, but I stay in great touch with Mick. And funnily enough, we were talking about this, and he came up with a great point. And he said, look, Rassie Erasmus obviously should have been coach of the year. He said, but this business of player of the match or player of the year, etc., if your fly half is player of the game, it probably means your tight head prop was player of the match, should have been player of the match. And the whole idea of rugby is this team game where everybody pulls together, everybody works hard to create an opening for your wing to score on the line. So how can you make the wing the player of the match? So I absolutely hate this. I'm not really involved in the controversy, the discussion about it. Some people love it. I hate it. But just to bring about the extent of my hypocrisy, perhaps the greatest achievement of my rugby life was in 1987 when I was named one of the 5 players of the year in South Africa. So having said that, when I got a little bit of an award, I was thrilled with it. But overall, I think it has no place in the game, and I think they should ban it.
I wanted to ask you about the coach of the year, just while we're on the subject now. There's some of our listeners or followers that sort of made the comment that shouldn't the coach of the year be the guy who did the best improving a team? Because that now points to the merits of being a coach. You took a bad team and you made them a good team. Or, and my counter argument was, listen, you've won 2 World Cups in a row, and then a year after the World Cup, where typically a lot of players retire, a lot of things change. The year after is typically a bit of a down year. Rassie not only did well, he won 11 out of 13 games, and apart from one drop kick that went over, like Harry said, and one place kick that didn't go over, we would have won 13 out of 13. Which one do you think of those 2 arguments merits being awarded Coach of the Year?
I couldn't give a damn. I really don't care, because it's such a subjective thing. I mean, to get a sevens coach who nobody has ever heard of, and winning the sevens was magnificent, but sevens is a completely different game. It is a completely different game. I mean, and you get a sevens player of the year and you get a 15s player of the year. So how can your coach of the year cross that divide? I mean, even talking about it, Envia makes me cross. It really does. And then you've got to say to yourself, what possible reason? And it has to be that because Rassie has pissed off people in the past with the video, and he has done and said some stupid things. And I think he'd probably be the very first to admit that. But then you say, I mean, if personal vendettas and personal, I don't know, ego comes into it, then how can you have it? You know, it's just, even talking about it, it irritates me. The one thing I do hope is that it motivates Rassie even more. I don't think he needs any motivation. As I say, I've never met Rassie over all the years, and I'd love to have a beer with him in a chat. But motivation never seems to be a problem. But if he needed any motivation, this snub, I think, would be the perfect mechanism for that. But let's not talk about players or coaches or whatever of the year, and let's move on.
I want to talk to you about, you just mentioned the word vendetta against Rassie, for example. Now we go back again to the league thing and the union thing. And there's such a, I could want to call it vendetta between, there was such a vendetta between these 2 leagues. And it's like you just said, Ken Goodall was banned he joined in 1917. Only in 1989 was he sort of forgiven and then started getting tickets and stuff like that. It took them 19 years. And we didn't discuss this before, but I seem to remember Ray Morton and Rob Lowe also going overseas to play for Wigan, if I'm not mistaken, 80-something. That's
right. That's right. It was, do you remember in 1985, and I was proud to be part of that Springbok team that was going to play the All Blacks in, you know, what would have been the sort of world championship. And then because of politics, because of a legal injunction taken, the All Blacks didn't come at the last minute. And we went on this dreadful internal tour where we played 4 games against barbarian sides. And it was an absolute total disaster. The senior players didn't want to go on the tour. The fans were all up for the barbarians. I remember I had the worst game of my life ever in the first game of that thing. And it just was horrible. And talking to Rob and Ray, who are both very, very good friends of mine and wonderful, wonderful players and wonderful people. And they were so fed up. And then it was, Ray was the target. And Gary Bailey, the soccer player's dad, who'd won a league medal with Ipswich Town as a goalkeeper. But he had friends who were involved in rugby league. And they came, and it ended up that they wanted Ray to go to Wigan. And Ray decided, to hell with it. You know, the rugby is not going to come back. I've had my best years at rugby. Let's make some money. And they were offered an incredible amount of money. And I think almost out of friendship, because they were very, very big mates. And Rob was in the same boat. He was fed up with rugby. I think he just started a business. And Ray sort of said, well, how about if the 2 of us go over? And they said yes. And I've spoken to Ray about it, and it's a fascinating story. So the Sunday papers, as they left, said Ray Mort and Rob Lowe have been in discussions with Wigan. And bear in mind, if you had discussions with a rugby club then, you were banned, no question. And in fact, I'll digress with a funny story, because the rugby league scouts used to go particularly to Wales to see if players were interested in going up north, as they called it. And what they used to do was, because they would watch like hawks to see if any rugby league scout was talking to a player. So after the game, the rugby league scouts used to go on the field with the crowd. In those days, the crowd used to wander onto the field or run onto the field after a game. And they used to give a little bit of paper and a pen as though they were asking for an autograph, which was allowed. And they'd say, "Can I have your telephone number? I'm from Wigan." And if the player gave the telephone number rather than the autograph, the scouts knew that he was up for an offer. I mean, that's how ridiculous the situation was. But anyway, Ray and Rob went over. And then they discovered that there was a cock-up. There'd been a problem. Things weren't as they had been told, and there wasn't an offer on the table. So they had this massive dilemma that by even announcing, or the journalists finding out that they were going, they burnt their boats with rugby union. They'd gone to the north of England and discovered that, in fact, there wasn't an offer on the table. And they now found themselves possibly out of rugby, league or union altogether. But anyway, discussions happened and they ended up going to Wigan. I've discussed it with Ray. It was hard. It was tough. They're two very, very different games, but they earned an awful lot of money. And Johan Rupert invested it for them, the money that they got signing on. And both of them ended up and doing very, very well in business. But as recently as that, you know, the sort of the mid-80s, there was still that incredible divide. And you mentioned Ken Goodall being brought back into the fold and being allowed to buy 2 international tickets, which in Ireland, as an ex-player, I have the right to buy 2 international tickets. They wouldn't give you the tickets, I can tell you. But even that decision, there were certain members of the union who were very much against it. That was seen as a controversial decision. But the background to league, and it's amazing, MV, how many people in South Africa have no idea about rugby league. You know, they see the odd player who comes from rugby league, and we have this guy, Suwali, I think his name is now, this Australian youngster who's 6'5" and is one of the most skilled players. He made his rugby union debut against England and was man of the match. There you are, man of the match again. But a lot of people don't understand the background to rugby league. And in the same way as we go back with Union and William Webb Ellis and, you know, the Twickenham and the Cabbage Patch that became Twickenham, etc. And we have our own stories and sort of history of rugby. To go back through rugby league is fascinating. Is that something you've looked at and followed?
No, I have absolutely no idea because there's nothing in South Africa. All I know now is from reading up about Ken Goodall, for example, is that in those days, Ken Goodall's one of his strong points was the fact that he was so good in lineouts. You mentioned he was 6'3". He had incredible explosive power. He could jump. And they also mentioned they were between 50 and 80, 5-0 and 8-0 lineouts in a match. And that means a lot of lineouts. There were no lineouts in the league, like you just mentioned. And something else that you'd mentioned to me earlier, I think it was 1968, you said, was the first time where a kick had to be from the 22, inside the 22, to be able to kick it out directly, wasn't it? And that changed the face of the game as well.
That's right. Now, there have been changes, but rugby league is fascinating because if you go back through the history of rugby union, we know that William Webb Ellis supposedly picked up the ball at rugby school in a game of football and ran with it, and this developed the game. And William Webb Ellis, who was a real person, he's buried in France. They found his grave and have now sort of looked after his grave, and it's almost a shrine of worship. But he had cousins who lived in Ireland, and there was a game in Ireland called CAD, C-A-I-D, CAD, which was a football, a bladder from an animal. It was covered in leather, and they played between villages and so on. And many people, particularly in Ireland, I might add, believe that William Webb Ellis got his love or this thing to run with the ball from Ireland. But there are many other stories around it. But what happened was the public schools in England had the football game. They had various varieties of football. And rugby was the one that drew up the formal rules. And then, of course, the players from these public schools, which means private in England, don't ask me why, they ended up going to universities across Britain and Ireland. And of course, they brought the games with them. And then you had various people set about bringing up the rules, etc. Then when they left the universities, they went and formed clubs, and the clubs started playing against the universities. And that was basically the background to rugby union. And it was only rugby, the rugby game. And it became very, very popular throughout the British Isles, as they were known in those days, including Ireland, which of course is now an independent country. And my old university, Dublin University, Trinity College, the oldest continuing existing club in the world, they had a guy called Barrington, who was one of the guys who drew up the formal rules of rugby. So rugby game spread, and it particularly took hold in the north of England. The north of England, which was far more industrialized than the south. So generalizing, you had a game that was hugely popular, but in the north of England, it tended to be played amongst working class people. In the south of England, it tended to be played amongst people who were middle class or upper class, who were university types and had more money. And it was ruthlessly agreed to be amateur by the people who ran the game, mostly from the south. The trouble was that the people who were playing in the north, if they went to play a game, even if it was for England, they had to take time off for work, which meant they lost a day or 2 or 3 days' wages. And the officials who came down to meetings in London lost a day's wages or money or whatever. So you had this sort of sociological split between north and south. And the clubs at the north said, look, we believe the players should get some compensation, which was an absolute, that was a no-go for the people in the south, because professional was seen as a dirty word. And incidentally, and not many people know this, I sound like Michael Caine now, there was the same split in soccer, association football. You had the posh clubs who wanted to stay amateur, the posh players, and you had the working class players, and I'm generalizing, as I said, but they wanted to allow some form of payment. And at one stage, you very nearly had the same split in soccer, association football, as you did in rugby. You nearly had a professional side splitting off from an amateur side, but they were able to avoid that. And now football is run with one organization in each country. But there was a famous meeting, I think it was in Huddersfield in the north of England, in the George Hotel, I think in 1895, where clubs got together and officials got together, and they announced that they were forming a separate union, the Northern Union, which was going to be separate from the South. And they were going to do their things their own way. And that was the start of rugby league. So if you talk about William Webb Ellis picking up the ball as the start of rugby, that meeting, I think it was in Huddersfield, I stand open to correction, in 1895. So that started the rugby league. And then, of course, once you had 2 separate organizations, and there wasn't initially a huge amount of enmity between them. In fact, at one stage, I think the professional players played the Southern players. It wasn't such a big thing until money started to become more important. And of course, then what happened was, with money being more important, it was more important for the northern teams to get gate money. Therefore, the game had to be more attractive and had to be more open and easy to watch. So the first thing they did was ban lineouts. And then they gradually banned the fight for the ball, which is so much a part of rugby union, where you win the ball and then you have to retain the ball and keep fighting for the ball with rucks and mauls, scrums and lineouts. So rugby league did away with the lineout. Then in some years later, they decided that there was too little space. There was too defensive. Now, doesn't that ring a bell with the game today? So they cut it to 13 players. And then they decided to, instead of after a tackle fighting for the ball, the team would retain the ball and heel it back. And there were changes to the scoring situation, etc. So that was the basis of rugby union and rugby league. Then what happened, and that was in the UK, and each of them has got their own tradition. One went professional, initially semi-professional, one went amateur, and you had this split because the people who ran the rugby union game were terrified of money coming into the game until 1995. But even more interesting is the background to rugby league in Australia and New Zealand. And I only discovered this quite recently, and it's fascinating. Can I continue with this?
Yeah, please. I'm fascinated. Yes.
If you look back at rugby union, the All Blacks tour, the very first All Blacks tour was to the British Isles in those days, Britain and Ireland, in 1905. And it was led by a guy from Ireland by the name of Dave Gallagher, who'd come from Donegal in Ireland. He'd gone to New Zealand, and he was captain of the first All Blacks. And they only lost one game on the tour. They played a huge number of games, 40 games or something, and they lost 3-0 to Wales with a disputed try, which is still disputed to this day. And they came back as absolute heroes. 1905, the Invincibles, the first New Zealand team that went. And of course, they were huge crowds that followed them. So two guys, a guy called George and a guy called Giltinen, said, hold on a second, there's money to be made out of this. So what they did was they started bringing this idea together of a professional tour, following up the 1905 Invincibles, and they were playing with this idea. Another guy by the name of Albert Baskerville, the same as the Hound of the Baskervilles, the famous Sherlock Holmes book. He was working in a post office, I think in Auckland, but it might have been Wellington. And one of his colleagues had a coughing fit while he was reading a newspaper. And he had a coughing fit and he dropped the newspaper, which happened to be an English newspaper. You know, they used to bring papers over from HQ, from the UK, and read them a month later or whatever. So our friend Baskerville picked up the paper, and it was the sports section, and they were talking about rugby league in England. And they were looking at club games with crowds of 40,000, 30,000, whatever, whereas Union played in front of, apart from the internationals, a couple of hundred. So he then somehow got in touch with our friends George and the other chap, Gilton, and they then set up a team, an international tour to go to the UK. And there was quite a bit of controversy because obviously the Union people felt that this was a paid tour, that it was a tour bringing them over to pay them. And in fact, they mockingly called them not the All Blacks, but the All Golds, because it was all about money. It was about moolah. And all the players were New Zealanders except one Australian. And on the way back, they played a game in Queensland against Queensland on the way back from this tour. And our friend Baskerville, he got pneumonia and he died. Having set up this whole tour, he died as they came back. And amazingly today, when Great Britain play or England play against New Zealand, they play for the Baskerville Trophy in honor of this particular man. But that was the founding of rugby league in Australia and in New Zealand. And of course, they had their different paths. One was more working class, one was more upper class. And then, of course, television came in. And once television came in, it became a battle for the soul of the games. And interestingly, if you look at the UK, television came in 1965 when rugby league was very much a northern game. It was, you know, up there in the north, it was big, but the country didn't really know about it. And almost as a gimmick, the BBC decided to show live rugby league. And interestingly, the controller of the BBC who made the decision is David Attenborough, the same David Attenborough who is this wildlife expert, specialist, zoologist all over the world. And he was the man who televised rugby league in the UK, which is, again, something not a lot of people know about. But the histories are absolutely fascinating. World Cups, funnily enough, you mentioned Andy Farrell in the World Cup. World Cups in rugby league have never really taken on because, you know, you've got New Zealand, you've got France, you've got Australia, and you've got the UK. So there's only really 4 teams. So it's never really caught on. The big games are the club games, the World Championships, and the series when Britain used to go over to Australia and play, like the Ashes in cricket. But I would advise anybody, a Union fan, because, you know, this program is mainly speaking about Union, to look at the history of rugby league and to look at the development, because some of the players and some of the tragedies, of course, players who came, made a lot of money, and then perhaps were unheard of, are abound as well. And there were many South Africans involved as well, like Tom van Vollenhoven, this superstar who was, by the modern generation, almost unknown in South Africa, which is tragic.
Well, that's it. I was about to talk to him just now, but before I do that, I wanted to make a comment here about your bar. We had a very interesting comment from someone who joked about you saying that you're a teetotaler, or were a teetotaler, I'm not sure, and then you're sitting in front of a bar. So just talk to me about that a bit, just quickly.
Well, this is obviously not a teetotaler. This is a bar at our house, which a very good friend and architect, Hugh Fraser, built for us. what is an Irishman without a bar? And I was a teetotaler for many years. And then just, in my sort of early 20s, decided I would drink, and I've sort of made up for it in the years gone by. But many a wonderful night has been had here with great rugby players. So any friends who come over, I'm thinking of the Murray Mexsteads of this world and the David Kirks of this world and so on, that if they come over here, I give them an invitation to come here and we have a marvelous night. So maybe we'll get you here, MV. And very kindly, I've got draft beer with Guinness and also Castle.
Well, up there. Sorry, you hear that noise outside your door? It's me pulling up there for my Guinness. I love Guinness. I love it.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much. Now, I want to talk to you about Tom van Vollenhoven, because this is also a South African channel, and not many people realize the impact that we mentioned Ray Mort and Rob Lowe, for example, but Tom van Vollenhoven was probably one of the brightest Springbok stars, the first Springbok to score a hat-trick for the Springboks, and then immediately after that, he went overseas to play league. And the interesting thing is, two teams were after him, St. Helens and Wigan, and that's quite an interesting story by itself. You would talk to me about that as well, please.
Well, Tom van Vollenhoven, who I knew quite well, and recently went to his funeral in the East Rand, and again to emphasize the split and the enmity at the time. There wasn't one member of the Blue Bulls or the South African Rugby Union, and I'm talking a couple of years ago now, attended his funeral, and there were about a dozen people who'd flown over from the UK wearing St. Helens jerseys, because he was such a legend, one of the most famous rugby league players of all time. He was a young superstar. He was from Bethlehem in the Free State, policeman, constable in Pretoria. And he was a bullet. He was absolutely a flyer. And he played in the second test. He played in the centre in the first test against the Lions in 1955. The famous game, they say the greatest rugby game ever played, where Jackie van der Schyff missed the kick that would have won it. And the Lions won, I think, 23-22. And the second test, they moved him to the wing, from centre to the wing, because he had a wonderful sidestep off one foot. And Darnie Craven said they wanted to come inside to link with the back row. And they felt this was a wonderful tactic. And he scored a hat-trick against Tony O'Reilly, the great Tony O'Reilly. He was one of the stars of this great series. He went to New Zealand in 1956, which wasn't a happy tour. It was one of the dirtiest tours on record. And the Springboks lost. And then, as you say, he was the hot property. And Wigan and St. Helens were after him. And there's the story about the guy with the offer from Wigan who got a puncture on the way to deliver it. And that was the reason why Tom van Vollenhoven went to St. Helens. And he became an absolute legend. He broke every record in the book. I think his try-scoring record, something like 590 tries in 620 games or something, still stands. And when Wigan opened when St. Helens opened their new stadium, some years ago, they had all the star players from the past. They honored the players from the past with a tunnel. And then who carried the match ball out for all these legendary players was Tom van Vollenhoven. And I think he was quoted as saying that his biggest fear was he was going to drop the ball when he was carrying it. But he came back to South Africa and again was basically sent to Coventry. He wasn't invited to games and so on. And I got him on the radio. I used to run a program on 702 called Sports Talk. And he came on and talked about his career and talked about going over and talked about how hard rugby league was. And again, if you Google him, he scored two of the greatest tries from sort of 80 meters in cup finals at Wembley. And you mention his name to anybody of a certain age from the north of England, and they will absolutely, like Ken Goodall from Ireland, they will look at you and say, my goodness, you knew Tom van Vollenhoven. And I spoke to him a number of times, and he was absolutely the loveliest guy. And he told me an interesting story, that in fact, the rugby league people were after Tony O'Reilly. And Tony O'Reilly was approached by every rugby league club and in Australia, because he was this young, fabulous, huge, fast Irish rugby player. And Tony O'Reilly, of course, went on to have an incredible business career. All went a little bit wrong at the end. But Tony O'Reilly said, no, I'm not interested. Excuse me, I'm not interested. But the guy you should go for is Tom van Vollenhoven in South Africa. So it was Tony O'Reilly who put the rugby league people onto Tom van Vollenhoven. And funnily enough, excuse me, when Tom sadly passed away, I actually wrote a note to Tony O'Reilly, who himself was very, very ill, informing him that I'd been at the service on the East Rand, and that Tom's greatest claim in life was that he'd scored a hat-trick against Tony O'Reilly. And Tony invited Tom and his wife many, many times to Ireland on holiday, and they remained the greatest friends, which I just think encapsulates what rugby should be all about, whether it's league or union.
Yeah, sure. It's actually, yeah, it's a bit sad almost to a degree, you know.
It is tragic in many ways. That's I mean, there's another guy, Wilf Rosenberg, of course, was an amazing player, and in the same series, he got picked in the second test because they moved Van Vollenhoven to the wing, and England had the Lions had this centre called Davis, who was huge and strong and aggressive, and in the first minute, Wilf Rosenberg knocked him backwards. And Wilf said the crowd went bananas. And in fact, at the end of the game, the Springbok team and the Lions team applauded Wilf Rosenberg off the field because he'd made such an incredible tackling move. He was at Wits University. He was of the Jewish faith. And in fact, as they always used to say, Danny Craven used to say, every great Springbok team had a policeman and a Jewish person on the team. And I remember Wilf Rosenberg said, I put that to him once, and he said, oh, yes, that's because if they lost, they could have somebody to blame, which I always thought, without being racist or anything, was quite amusing. But Wilf was doing medicine at Wits, and his father was a rabbi. And Wilf told me the story himself. And he was under a lot of pressure because of apartheid in South Africa. The world was starting to become aware of how wrong apartheid was. And Leeds were one of the great rugby league clubs in the north of England. And Leeds had a huge Jewish community who mostly were involved in the rag trade or the cotton trade or whatever. And the rugby league people thought, because they weren't interested in rugby league, and they thought, if we can get a Jewish player to play for Leeds, it'll bring this whole section of the community in. And suddenly in South Africa, there was this Jewish Springbok called Wilf Rosenberg. Now, you're not going to believe this, but Wilf was on honeymoon with his wife, this young Springbok with his, the world at his feet. And then his father sent him a message to say, I've signed for you to go to Leeds to play rugby league. You're going to continue your medical career, which he ended up changing to dentistry. And Wilf had no say in the matter, went over and played for Leeds, great rivals of St. Helens and Wigan, and ended up becoming an absolute superstar as well. And again, breaking scoring records. But another guy, because the union people, a lot of the union people will have heard of Tom van Vollenhoven and Wilf Rosenberg, but perhaps that's what they knew about, and that's why it's lovely to talk about them now. But there was another player called Vigo Green, or Green Vigo is his name. I've got it wrong. And he was from the coloured community in the Cape. And he was a magnificent centre and wing at the time when Errol Tobias was coming through. And he ended up going on tour with the Federation side in the 70s. And then he played against England in 1972 over here when the touring side said we must play against teams of colour. It all seems so ridiculous now, MV, but it was a big deal at the time. And he had a starring role, as did Errol Tobias, in that 1972 game against England. And they were both offered money to go rugby league. Errol stayed, but Green Vigo went over to the UK and ended up becoming a star player as well. For two separate clubs over there, he was an absolute legend of the game and ended up retiring and living, and I think he's passed away now. But if you talk to, again, people who are rugby league and they talk about Green Vigo, an absolute legend. Now, you mentioned Green Vigo here to anyone, perhaps, except those from the Western Cape amongst the coloured community, and they've never heard of them. So I would love to see a function, or I'd love to see a program, or I'd love to see something where the players who went rugby league could be honoured because they were just as big as superstars as the great players that we know. But if you Google rugby league and the South African connection, And there is rugby league being played in South Africa now on a smaller level, but it's been played now. They tried to start it in the 60s, but there was a bit of a row about who controlled it. And of course, rugby union and the government stepped in and basically stopped it. But it's an amazing history and something that hasn't been really explored by many people here.
Before we move on to Andy Farrell, I just want to ask you one thing. You mentioned the North. You mentioned many times now. And the North, when I think about the North, I think about cold and desolate and industrialized and poor almost. I don't know English that well. Please excuse my ignorance. And you've got a guy like Tom van Vollenhoven coming from Bethlehem, which is like rural South Africa, coming to Pretoria, which is Afrikaans speaking. And then going overseas to this completely almost alien kind of environment, community, and then making such a success of his career then. What's it like, what would that, how difficult would it have been for him to adapt to those kind of circumstances and then still make a success of it? I'm just trying to wrap my head around it.
I think it would be probably easier in terms of becoming comfortable with the situation if he'd gone to the moon. I mean, it was so different. I mean, there's some beautiful areas in the north of England. You think of the Yorkshire Dales and the Pennines and beautiful, beautiful coastlines, etc. But it's where the big industrial cities were for the Industrial Revolution, because that's where the coal and that's where the steel was, and you tended to get this very, very working class atmosphere. And it wasn't even in his day, I mean, talking to Ray Mort and Rob Lowe. I mean, particularly Rob Lowe. You think of Rob Lowe, this sort of surfing Stellenbosch graduate who looked like a movie star, a glamorous preacher, and he rocks up. And unlike Ray, who went straight into the Wigan first team, Rob Lowe went into the second team. And he tells a lovely story about his first game, I think was on a wet Tuesday night, playing at Hunslet, which is one of these sort of slightly out of the way places. And he sat down with his Wigan team, and the first thing he did was told, don't sit there. Rob sat in a certain seat in the dressing room, and he said, no, so-and-so always sits there. And Rob said, oh, why? He said, no, he's a bit crazy, and he's just come out of jail, and he's been in for violence, extreme violence, so don't sit there. And then Rob Lowe says how they started to get stripped for the game, and before it was fashionable, all the players had tattoos all over their bodies. And Rob couldn't believe this. And then the last thing they did was they all took out their teeth. They didn't have gum shield. They all lost their teeth because of the high tackling in rugby league. And I remember Rob looking around the sort of beach bum from Stellenbosch and saying, what have I let myself in for? Okay. But both of them say, with the exception of the coach for some reason didn't like. He was from New Zealand and from a rugby league background in New Zealand. And a lot of New Zealand rugby league people feel that, the All Blacks are so worshipped and loved that a lot of the rugby league people get a rough deal. And so Rob, and particularly Ray, didn't get treated well at Wigan and were happy to come back with injuries. But that was how it was. And I can imagine for Tom, it was exactly the same. And remember, unlike Rob and Ray, who were sort of getting to the ends of their careers, they were getting on 30. I mean, Tom van Vollenhoven, I think, was 22 years of age. He was an absolute youngster. But he said that in his first game, he dropped a pass or something like that, made a terrible mistake that led to a try. But they had a centre, a very good centre, who was quite an experienced player. And his job was to nurse Tom van Vollenhoven. And late in the game, he put Tom away and he scored a spectacular try. And Tom said the people were so lovely to him and his wife and so on. And they made him feel so welcome that he loved it. And as I say, at his funeral, and I was privileged to be there, I was disgusted at the lack of presence of anybody, virtually anybody from Union, with a few exceptions. Herman LaRue, the famous journalist, I remember meeting him at the funeral. And the number of people who travelled from the UK, and the whole service consisted of people wearing St. Helens jerseys, the famous V from St. Helens. And I was delighted to be there, but it just showed the passion of the people and how much they love it. And rugby league is a wonderful game. It's a wonderful game. Somebody said, how do you describe rugby league in Union? And I don't know if do you watch rugby league at all? You can watch.
Never.
You can watch it late in the evening on ESPN. They show the Australian Rugby League, which is terrific. And the best description I got was somebody said that, and this is not in no way critical because they're both wonderful games with a wonderful history and a wonderful tradition and terrific players, athletes involved. But somebody said rugby league is like checkers. It's a very simple game to watch. Once the ball is in play, you've got 13 players who are almost all the same, and they basically have 6 attempts to get through, score a try, whatever, 5 attempts, then they kick it, and then the other side gets the ball. So it's just this to and fro, to and fro. So it's like checkers. Rugby union is like chess. It's far more complicated. It's far more subtle. At times it looks a little bit silly, and it's not as obvious to the outsiders. And I thought that was the best description of the two. And I suppose you could also say that rugby league is like ODI cricket, whereas rugby union is a bit like test cricket. And it'll be interesting to see how they go on and how many players move from one sport to the other.
I'm glad you brought up the sort of metaphor of chess, because that's how I see rugby coaches nowadays. Chess grandmasters, basically, because what happens on the field is their brainchild. It's they figure it out, the moves, and get the right people in to help them and get the right players selected, everything.
I think you should add that it's full contact chess. Full contact.
No, of course. But at least the coach is up there, with his lights and stuff, but he's not involved in it. But the point is, the mind.
I hope it never gets to the stage where you've got gridiron football, where you've got a quarterback and he's got the coach in his ear, and coach tells him what to do, and he tells the team what to do, and they do it. They're just automatons, the players. The beauty of rugby, of course, is that every player gets a decision to make in certain circumstances, and long may it continue.
No, I agree with that. That's one of the things we talked about with this Coach of the Year thing. It was whether the teams are being overcoached now, that all the initiative is being taken away from the players, and you can't play what's ahead of you anymore because you have to stick to the plan, to the structure. There's a lot of debate going on about that. But while we're talking about the coaches now, let's move on to Andy Farrell and Joe Schmidt.
Yeah.
Start with Andy Farrell, because he was also a league convert to union. So the other way around this time. Talk to me about his league past, and then when he switched over to union, wasn't that successful in union, and you met him, and I both agreed he looks like a very hard man. I wouldn't want to cross him.
He's an absolute gentleman to meet him. I'll give you the circumstances I met him. That Joe Schmidt, of course, who's this legend of the game, and you talk about he's a micromanager, but does it to bring the best out of people. And funnily enough, Paul O'Connell, who now, of course, is one of the forward coaches with Ireland, talked about when Joe Schmidt came into the Irish setup. And almost as a good teacher, with Joe's background is teaching, the way a good teacher doesn't just tell you something, he explains it to you again until it gets inside your head and you sort of say, I now get it, I understand, and I can actually enjoy what you've taught me. He does the same in rugby, but he's also tough. His very first session with Leinster, he came over, he criticized Brian O'Driscoll for something. And Brian O'Driscoll was like God at that stage, the best player in the world, probably. And the Leinster players said, wow. Do you remember the series where Ireland came over with Joe Schmidt? And in the first test, CJ Stander, who was playing for Munster and Ireland, got sent off for the high ball. Do you remember that?
Effectively ending Pat Ramby's career, no?
It ended Pat's career very, very sadly. But Ireland won that first test, and then South Africa came back and won the next two. And it was a very, very close series. But Ollie Campbell, my great rugby mate, Leinster and the Irish Lions and so on, the one guy I stayed very, very close to, he became very friendly with Joe Schmidt because obviously Joe knew of Ollie's expertise and his mind for rugby. And they became very good friends. And there was also the Irish manager, a guy called Mick Carney, who I'd played against at schools level and club level and even interprovincial. I played with him, I think, at interprovincial level, but at least we were at that same level. And they invited me, the Irish rugby team, to have beer with the coaching team and then have tea with dinner with the international team. And it was funnily enough, they presented me with an Irish jersey, which was lovely. And I replied by saying, when I played for Ireland, all you wanted to do was drop me. So it's very nice that you now want to give me a jersey. And I met the Irish team and it was wonderful. But in that beer beforehand, And funnily enough, we've just remembered something. While I was waiting for the management team and we were in the bar at the Santon Sun, Jenny and I, Rassie Erasmus came in. And I was just about to go up to Rassie Erasmus and say, Rassie, you know, we haven't met before. And then Donal Lenihan, the great Irish lock who now does wonderful commentary on the television, he said, John, how are you? And I missed meeting Rassie, and I've never met Rassie, but I nearly met him. But Donal Lenihan came and said hello. We had a great chat. So I was introduced then to the Irish coaching team with Joe Schmidt and with Andy Farrell and the rest of the guys. And it was fascinating to chat to them and about Ireland. And I said to them, look, guys, I'm just telling you, I'm a Springbok supporter. So, you know, and of course I would never pass on anything, but just to let you know, I'm a Springbok supporter. So don't be giving me any secrets or anything. And they roared with laughter. And we had a fabulous evening, one of the best of my life. But I remember talking to Andy and I said, do you remember Ray Mort and Rob Lowe coming over? And he said, yes, I was with the under-18s. And suddenly these two South Africans came over, these glamorous South Africans who were these wonderful, wonderful players. And he remembered it. But I was so struck about, how quiet Andy Farrell was, because when you saw him playing on the field, particularly in league, he was a colossus, an absolute colossus. And if you Google New Year's Day game between Wigan and Warrington, New Year's Day, Wigan and Warrington, I forget the year, but you will see the dirtiest game of rugby that has ever been played, ever, of either code. And I say that without fear of contradiction. And it was, and Andy Farrell was right in there. And I looked at this 6'4" guy with the broken nose, but he's done a magnificent job. And I think that it's interesting because league was where he was a superstar. And if you remember, he switched to Saracens and he played in the World Cup in France that South Africa won, the Springboks won. He played in that game where we beat them, I think 36-0 in the early round and so on. And he never quite made it. England could never quite decide if he was a centre or a back row player. And then he was assistant coach with many, many teams. And now he's taken over the Irish coach. And of course, he's going to coach the British and Irish Lions in Australia, presumably against Joe Schmidt. So they're great friends. They know each other backwards. And I think it adds a real bit of spark and flavour to this game, which hopefully will be an exciting one this weekend.
Yeah, the interesting thing about Andy Farrell is he was a forward in league and he was a superstar. And then in 2005, he went over to Union. And I don't think many people know that in that 36-0 game against England, an opening match of the World Cup in 2007 that we won, he played centre for England. Yeah. So it's interesting to me that he could play centre in Union, but he was a forward in league. So what does that mean? What does it tell us about the difference in the games? Just as a matter of interest.
Well, I think I mentioned, I mean, again, Andy Farrell, you know, was he a centre? Was he a back row forward? And at one stage he was playing back row forward for Saracens, but England wanted him in the centre. Remember when we talked about rugby league that once the game is kicked off, basically the players are exactly the same. There's two lines of people against the other. They have no rucks, they have no mauls, they have no lineouts. They just simply tackle. They try and knock holes in each other's defenses. They've got subtle hands. Because the defenses are so tight, and we talk about high tackles today. You watch in league, there are very few low tackles. Almost in desperation, you'll tackle somebody low if you're chasing him from behind. But the tackles are here. You get hit by two people coming here. And again, high tackles that used to abound in the game are very, very strictly monitored here. But as a result, the offloading, you know, the games start off very, very conservative, where players take the knock, they take the knock, they take the knock, they take the knock. And then because it's such a fast pace, and because there are no breaks, well, the scrums are just in and out and away, there are no breaks for lineouts, etc. The players get tired. The physical effort is unbelievable, which is why you don't get the squat, fat props that you do in Union, because A, they don't scrummage. The scrummage are almost sort of how can I put it? What I'm looking for is, you know, there's no contest in the scrums. It's just a way of starting the game. There's no actual scrummaging involved. And so as a result, you don't get the big fat guys. You don't get the 6'9" players because it's no advantage. So you tend to get muscular, hugely well-developed, fast and tough players. And as a result, I mean, there are certain players who are able, with wonderful skills, to take a tackle and to offload. You think of Sonny Bill Williams. I mean, that's why Union brought him in, because of his offloading skills. You think of this Suwali now playing for Australia. And Andy Farrell, I think they hoped he would bring that side of the game. And also, of course, he was a good goal kicker. He was, I think, the second highest goal kicking for Great Britain, record holder that played for them. But I think he probably came a wee bit too late. But I think his rugby league background and his coaching apprenticeship that he served in Union, plus the couple of years he played for Union, have set him up to become one of the great coaches. And he just seems to have the respect. I've mentioned to you before that people talk about what makes a great coach. And obviously you have to have technical ability. But what makes a great coach is somehow you get the players to play for you. They talk about playing for the country. They talk about weeping and wailing at national anthems and playing for the badge and so on. I believe that's nonsense. The really great coaches, I mean, of course it applies. It's lovely to play for your country. But the really great coaches get the players to play for you. At the end of the game, you respect the coach so much that when you come off, that nod that says, well played, that means more than all the newspaper cuttings and the players of the game and the players of the year and so on. And it looks to me like Andy Farrell has taken what Joe Schmidt started and has taken it to the next level. But, of course, as we always say about poor old Ireland, they can't get over that quarterfinal hurdle in the World Cup.
Yeah, you said it, not me. But anyway, interesting thing, you talked about players playing for the coach and having the changing room, you know, that's kind of a saying. The one guy that I think is a bit under pressure in that sense is Steve Borthwick with England. And interesting, I noticed that him and Andy Farrell co-captained Saracens. And afterwards, Andy went on to become an assistant coach for England. But they know each other. Like I said, everything is sort of interconnected. And the interesting thing for me was when Eddie Jones took over as England coach in 2015, he was one of the guys who fired Andy Farrell. And then Andy went over to England in 2016 to join Joe Schmidt. So it's sort of almost very incestuous.
Well, he went to Munster first. I think he went as a
because he wasn't allowed to contractually. He had to sort of wait out his time, but he ended up with Ireland as well.
Yeah. Well, it's very difficult to say. I mean, and I mean, but who would coach England? You know, England has more players than any other country by a country mile. They have more money than anybody. And yet with the exception of Clive Woodward, who was, I think, lucky enough to have Martin Johnson and a wonderful pool of talent involved.
Johnny Wilkinson.
Yeah, exactly, Johnny Wilkinson, and so many others. You know, Johnny Wilkinson gets the credit, but there were so many other. I mean, that centre Greenwood was magnificent, Will Greenwood, and yet never gets the Ben on the wing, Wilson Ben Cohen on the wing. Sorry, my brain is going now. And Matt Dawson at scrum half, the back row, etc. You know, they were just a wonderful, wonderful team. But with the exception there, you always get the feeling that England are underperforming. And even now, I can see England laying the basis for a very, very good side. I can see England, you know, they've lost some games, but they've gone close against top sides. And yet, the pressure from the media, the pressure from fans, etc., it could end up with Borthwick getting fired. I mean, who knows? But I think certainly with this Six Nations coming up now, he's going to be under an awful lot of pressure. And it'll be interesting to see how Ireland do with Farrell concentrating perhaps on the Lions. But well, Ireland also under pressure, because I mentioned before, and I got into all sorts of trouble for saying that I think a level of arrogance has crept into Ireland, which was never there, and particularly amongst their fans, amongst their journalists, etc. I mean, they have a long way to go. They might have been number one in the world before they can start talking about having a history of winning, like the Springboks, like the All Blacks, even like Wales, who are down at the moment. And I think that has crept in. And obviously a poor performance against Argentina. Fiji were terrible, and then losing to the All Blacks. I mean, that's put Ireland under a lot of pressure now, and it certainly adds a bit of grist to the mill looking forward to the Six Nations.
Interesting thing, Andy Farrell's now sort of stepped away from the Irish post after the season to focus on the Lions. And there's a lot of stories going around that he might not be coming back to Ireland. And the thing that immediately pops up is England. We talk about his
Yeah.
son playing for England, and he's an English player. I wonder how much merit there is to that.
Well, I simply don't know. And of course, the rumor mill fueled by social media, now we really don't know. But I think anybody who's played for a country would want to go back and coach that country if you get into coaching. I mean, we think of Joe Schmidt was doing wonderfully well in Ireland, and then he went back and he went to the International Rugby Board as a technical whatever. But when he got a chance to get into New Zealand, I mean, he was very, very keen to get there. Now, of course, he's gone to Australia, and I think for a coach, but ultimately, I'm sure Joe Schmidt is saying, I'd love to go back and be the full-time coach of New Zealand at some stage. And Andy Farrell, I mean, is a proud Englishman. There's no question about it. And it's the highest paid job in rugby, supposedly, apart from you, MV, with your, all this. I mean, I think you're the only one who gets more out of this than...
Just get the facts straight,
than coach of England. So we'll see. But I would imagine his thoughts are full-time on the Lions and trying to pick a Lions team at the moment. I mean, you look at the way Scotland are playing, perhaps not in terms of beating the big boys, although they beat Australia well. In terms of the way they're playing and some of the individual performances, you look at Ireland, who, a couple of years ago would have had the majority of Lions players. There are a couple of players there now who think maybe it's going to be a bridge too far. There are youngsters coming through who are doing brilliantly. So I think the Six Nations and then selection for the Lions is going to be very, very interesting. And it's great to see Australia coming back. I think they'll play well against Ireland. As much for the coach. We talked about playing for the coach because obviously Joe will want to do very well against the Irish team that he basically brought along, so many of them. And hopefully that'll set up a wonderful, wonderful series in Australia, because a couple of years ago, it didn't look very inviting indeed. And Australian Rugby Union is in such trouble that it desperately needs a good Lions series to give it a boost.
I want to talk to you about Joe Schmidt quickly. You mentioned that he would have given his left arm to coach the All Blacks, but he actually turned down the opportunity to join them in 2018 because with the idea of taking over from Steve Hansen, and he decided to stick to Ireland. And then barely 2 years later, he left Ireland anyway. I wonder why he made that decision now, and if he regrets it, because then he went to join the All Blacks as attack coach for the World Cup and the likes. And now he's with Australia. It's like Rassie Erasmus going to coach England now. It just doesn't feel all that natural, almost, if I can use that term.
Well, I think he's a human being, and all of us make decisions that often at times seem crazy. I mean, we've talked about my decision to come to South Africa when every sensible person was going the other way. And yet that changed my life in so many ways, and the life of my family. Joe also has, I mean, he's a big family man, but he does have a son who has a type of a disability, which has always been very, very important to him. And I think at the time his kids were at school, they went to Terramuir College, which is a big, big rugby playing school in Ireland, a very, very famous rugby school, and a tough rugby school. I can tell you, I still bear the scars from playing against them. So maybe the personal circumstances changed. Maybe the kids were there. I know he said he wanted to go back to New Zealand for his son at one particular stage. So I really don't know what the thinking was. He's changed around a fair bit, but what he did for Ireland was incredible. And as I say, that first training session with Leinster, when he gave a very, very polite but veiled criticism of Brian O'Driscoll. I remember another story, MV, when Ireland beat the Springboks, as they did in a number of times. They beat the Springboks, and they'd done an analysis on the Springbok defense, and they'd realized that, I can't remember the details, but the back three, one of them was out of position. So Ireland set up a quick ruck, and then I think it was Conor Murray chipped the ball into space, and it was the Irish winger took the ball and scored under the post. And they did the move during the game, and it worked perfectly. He chipped the ball forward, and the ball hopped up into the Irish winger's hand, and he scored under the post. And it was just wonderful. A plan worked beautifully. And Joe Schmidt was furious or disappointed because in the working of the plan, which they've done 100 times in practice, the ball was supposed to drop into the winger's hand. It wasn't supposed to bounce up. And Joe was such a perfectionist that really irritated him. And I think there was a criticism that he was too much of a micromanager at one stage. He did too much micromanaging. He actually started to annoy some of the players in the later years. But I'm sure he will have taken that on board and learned from it, because he's an extremely modest, extremely intelligent guy who absolutely loves rugby. And I think you've got to get that, like a lot of coaches. Paul, and funnily enough, Paul O'Connell spoke about it. When he was a player and a captain of Ireland, it was very much emotion, emotion, emotion. Now he's taken on board the quieter, more intellectual side, and you have a mixture of the two. So Joe, who perhaps early on was hugely intellectual about the game, he's now maybe relaxed a little bit on that and taken on maybe slightly more of a motivational side. I don't know. All I do know is both of them are extraordinary coaches, and we're going to see one hell of a battle this weekend.
Just getting towards the end, I just wanted to ask you, the performance against Scotland for me was a bit disappointing, especially after that win against the English. It was unexpected, and they pulled it up last moment. And Su'ali'i, like you said, those hand skills, the subtle, soft skills, incredible. You can clearly see what you talked about with league there. But against Scotland, they were never in the game, and that to me is a bit worrying. And it's a credit to Joe Schmidt that we actually think that Australia might stand a chance against a team like Ireland, who's now number 2 in the world again. You know, and how far Joe Schmidt has come in the couple of months that he's been there. Australia was right down in the dumps, make no mistake, and they've turned things around. It's looking better there.
Yeah, I think that I looked at that, and like you, I was expecting a really close game. I mean, it was a good game. There's no question. There were some wonderful tries scored in that game, but I was expecting a very, very close game, and Australia were well beaten. To me, they just looked tired. To me, it looked like 3 games on the trot, obviously with this added pressure of being a team that's coming from nowhere on the way up, a bit like the Springboks when Rassie started. And I think that looking at a team that's on the way up, the first thing you do is you sort out the obvious things. You sort out the set pieces, you sort out the defense. Then what you do is you start to develop an attacking style or a way that can turn it into wins. And probably the hardest thing is to get that fully expansive game that we are now looking to get under Tony Brown. So if you like, we've got all bases covered. But the other thing that's very hard to get is consistency. That consistency. Now, you think of the All Blacks 5 years ago or whatever it was, when they were absolutely in the pump. You look at that England team under Clive Woodward when they nearly got the record. You think of South Africa under Nick Mallet. When you get that consistency, you watch a team and you know, even if they're having a bad game, that they will pull it off somehow. And under Rassie, we've got that feeling now. Even if we're 10 points down against somebody with 10 minutes to go, I know you and I know that something is going to happen. Bomb Squad will push him over, or Cheslin Colby or Elric Lowe, somebody will do something magnificent, or Pollard will start kicking from anywhere. And I think that's the one thing that he hasn't got yet with the Australian team is consistency. And I think that comes because I talked about the players playing for you and the effort that the players are putting in. I mean, you look at the effort, the physical effort those Australians are putting in, and you compare it to Eddie Jones during his reign, where he obviously lost the players for whatever particular reason. There was no respect there. So even though the players are now playing for him, I think they haven't got that level of consistency. And I think that's something that will be the last thing to come into that Australian side. But I can see positives there. First of all, their set piece is a lot better than it was. Their scrummaging is starting to look decent, where for years we always thought that was always the big weakness with Australia. And my goodness, they've got speed. You look at the speed they've got in the background, and this Su'ali, who sadly seems to have picked up an injury, what he's going to bring the team is magnificent. They've got excellent goal kicking, and they've got a little bit of strength and depth. I look at the scrum halves there. They've got, Tate McDermott, and you've got Gordon, and you've got our friend, well, I won't mention his name. The
Oscar winner, yeah.
The Oscar winner. I won't mention him, but he's still a hell of a good player. And as I say, I think they're on the up. But to explain last weekend, I think it's about consistency. And I think then they will have been working and saying, right, where did we over-try? What went wrong in terms of our mental perception of the game? Was it simply fatigue? Did we get a little bit overconfident after two good games? Let's put that right. And what better way of putting it right than against Ireland at the weekend? I can hardly wait.
No, just Ireland's, what you said to me about Australia, what about Ireland? They didn't really convince against Fiji, I don't think. I see people saying that was their best game. I don't see that. Playing against the All Blacks, it's not the Ireland that we used to. The bench is creaking. That's one of the words, the terms I've heard being bandied about. There's a couple of problems in Irish rugby at the moment. They're not what they used to be.
Yeah, you could maybe point to injuries, and you look at some of the greats, the Tadhg Furlongs of the world, the Porters of the world. Maybe they've just gone a little bit over their sell-by date. I think the biggest problem is at fly half. Johnny Sexton was such a legend, and before that, Ronan O'Gara. And again, my friend Michael Dunn, who now lives in Wexford, I mentioned him earlier on. He said that Johnny Sexton actually acted as a coach on the field, which is a hell of a difficult thing to get that balance right. Because if you're shouting, and at one stage I was a bit like that in teams that I played for. I was very, very vocal. I was very, very convinced, and I think I said I was a better captain than a player. But if you don't have the respect of the players, that simply doesn't work. Now, Johnny Sexton had earned that, and he almost used to coach the team as it went along. And now you've got a succession of fly halves who've come in. They've looked good at times. They've looked weak at times. Now we've got this Prendergast who everybody is raving about. A bit like Sasha Feinberg with us and Ngomazulu with us. I think there's been too much praise put on his shoulders, his young shoulders. He's been talked up too much at this particular time. But he certainly looks very, very promising. And if you have a fly half in your team at top level who cannot almost dominate effortlessly, I'm talking about mentally now, then your team is in trouble. And of course, confidence comes into it. I'm a big soccer fan as well, a Manchester United fan, but I look at Manchester City, who've been the top team possibly in world football for the last 4 or 5 years, and now they haven't won in 5 games. They lose 4-0 at home. Suddenly, that air of invincibility is gone, and putting your finger on it is very, very difficult. There'll certainly be no lack of effort for Ireland because, as you say, they're not getting a huge credit for the Fiji win, but you can only play the team that's up against you. If the team up against you is a little bit weak, is a little bit loose, and you win, put 50 points on them, you can hardly criticize. But defensively, there seem to be some errors creeping in. And just suddenly, I've again talked about that balance, that fine balance between confidence and overconfidence. And when that goes, then you get a situation of underconfidence, which can become desperation. And then you can find yourself in trouble. So the question will be answered this weekend. Like the All Blacks, you don't suddenly go from being a great team or a great player into a bad player. It doesn't happen suddenly. And I'll be very interested to see how the individuals on the Irish team and also which team is selected, because at this moment we don't know the selection.
Yeah, see, the thing is, this test between Australia and Ireland is going to be the opener for the real test game, which is going to be the Bulls against Connacht later that night.
Connacht is one of, I think I've said, the great success stories, which is fantastic. I hope the weather is decent.
I was just wondering about, availability, because the URC is now starting the same weekend as the final test is being played. I wonder how many of those Irish players are going to be available for Ireland. I'm not sure. I'm just asking.
I don't know how
that do I, yeah.
Which anyway, it's a little bit crazy that. I mean, if your national team is playing, you should be able to pick your best players.
I think the players are available. I didn't pick up anything that they're not. So I suppose, like Bundi Aki is basically your only Connacht player. I'm not sure about the Ulster and Leinster guys. Yeah, but I think they're available. I think they might be available, from what I understand.
Yeah. I know Tadhg Furlong is out. He's injured. Yeah. And there's somebody who has a suspension. They're out, but we'll see the team that plays.
Next time I want to talk to you about Munster, Graham Roundtree, packing his bags in half and a puff, things like that. What's happening there? That's something I want to talk to you about.
But also the history of Munster, and of course the 1978 when they beat the All Blacks 11-0, and I mean that's still 12-0, and they made that's still the most legendary game ever. And the Thomond Park in those days held 10,000 people, and yet 500,000 people were at the game.
Entire island. All right, John, thank you. We spent a lot of time now talking about a lot of things. So that's fascinating as always. And next time, like I said, we'll probably be talking about Munster or something like that. But thank you for the time, and thank you for having these chats with us.
It's lovely. I absolutely love it. I hope I don't live in the past too much. I love the modern game, but I'm passionate about players not being forgotten, some of the greats. So it's lovely chatting to you about it, MV. All the best, mate.